Hello, and welcome to this class on Japan's emergence as a world power. Um, Previously, we have looked at Japan's rapid modernization and military development. We have looked at some important milestones on the way to Japan's emergence as a world power, such as the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, and the Anglo-British Alliance of 1902. So today we're going to look more closely at what happens after the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 and Japan's role in particular in the First World War and consider what its global position was by 1918. So we will first of all be looking at Japanese policy in Korea, Manchuria, and China after 1906. We will be looking at Japan's role in the First World War. We will be considering why Japan was unable to fully impose its 21 demands on China. And finally, we will be considering how far was Japan a world power in 1918? This is a sort of popular question that pops up in the CIE exam from time to time, and also the question of if it did become a world power, when did it become a world power? Was it after 1895? Was it after 1902? Was it after 1905? 1918, or maybe later. So we will be looking at that as well. So to start off with, the Russo-Japanese War comes to an end in 1905. As you might remember, the United States steps in to mediate between Japan and Russia, and as a result, a peace treaty is signed, the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905. Portsmouth, of course, is a place in the United States. It is where the Russian and Japanese diplomats meet, hosted by President Roosevelt of the United States. So, as a result of the Treaty of Portsmouth, the Russians agreed to withdraw from Manchuria. They also agreed to withdraw from Port Arthur and the Liaotung Peninsula, which is now transferred to Japanese control. They recognize that Korea is to be in the Japanese sphere of influence, and a place where Japan can exercise its influence and control. And after some hard negotiations, they agree that half of Sakhalin Island will be ceded to Japan. Now, this was in fact less than what the Japanese were hoping for. The Japanese actually were hoping to get all of Sakhalin Island. They were hoping to get more territory in Manchuria, and they were also hoping to get reparations. But the Russians flatly refused to give any reparations, insisting that it would not be consistent with their honor to do so. So after this war, arguably Japan's status as a great power seems to have been confirmed. They had taken on and defeated another European great power, and so one might make the argument that this shows that Japan was now a great power as well. Of course, there is the debate over whether the Japanese victory was more due to Russia's weaknesses rather than its own strengths. But certainly, the British, for their part, were pleased that their ally Japan had won, that Russian expansionism into East Asia had been checked, and so the British were happy to renew their alliance with the Japanese in 1905 and once again in 1911. These alliances often had, they were usually only for a limited amount of time. So they kind of had an expiry date with the option that if both sides want to continue the alliance, they can renew it. and that the British were quite happy to do this. And the British and the Japanese also kind of worked out that, um, made agreements about other parts of Asia. For example, Japan acknowledged British authority in India and pledged to its joint defense in the case of war. So this was useful for the British because in case there was a threat to India, and the country most likely to threaten India was Russia, the Japanese would take part in defending it. So another uh, possible uh, point or argument that Japan was now uh, a great power was that following the defeat of Russia, it was not just Japanese claims in Korea that were recognized by the Russians. Um, the French concluded an agreement where they recognized um, Japanese control over Korea and so on in return for Japan recognizing French claims in Indochina. Russia and Japan recognize each other's claims. America and Japan recognize each other's claims. So Japan says, yes, we recognize Philippines belongs to you, and in return, America recognized that Japan has influence over Korea, southern Manchuria, and Taiwan. Domestically, what was the impact of the war? Well, the war had been won, but it had placed great strains on Japanese society. In particular, a great economic strain. There had been very large loss of life. 85,000 soldiers had died, approximately, and hundreds of thousands more were wounded. During the war, there were food shortages back home. The government had to borrow money and raise taxes. And then once the war was over, they had to maintain high taxation because they needed to, repay those loans. So at the end of the war, there were actually riots and protests in the streets of several Japanese cities because the public, when the agreement that was signed, the Treaty of Portsmouth, when the provisions of the Treaty of Portsmouth became known, many people were quite upset and disappointed. They felt that, wait a minute, we were being told about these glorious Japanese victories, and we were making so much sacrifices, high taxes, the war dead, and so on. And yet we have not gotten much out of this. In particular, we're not going to get any reparation payments, and so paying off the loans that they had taken, mostly from British banks, is going to have to be done through high taxation. So there were protests, there were riots, and there was anger with the government. It didn't seem to be the kind of victory that many people, members of the public, had been accepting. Um, so beyond this, over the following 10 or 15 years after the Russo-Japanese War, um, it was a time of great political and social turmoil, and also perhaps progress in Japan. There was a growing public awareness of political issues. There was a growing public awareness of the fact that Japanese democracy was extremely limited in the Meiji era, and more people started to feel that we must make our voices heard, that we too must have a say in government. So this era became known as the Taisho democracy era in Japan. New political parties were founded, demanding more liberal reforms, such as universal suffrage. All adult men should be allowed to vote, demanding economic reforms, demanding that the creation of labor unions to fight for workers' rights should be legalized, in some cases demanding political participation for women, that women too should be allowed to vote or run for office. So in response for all these growing demands for democratization, The hardline sort of Meiji leaders responded by trying to increase surveillance and censorship and trying to keep a sort of lid over this sort of growing political demands amongst the masses within the country. Um, Outside Japan, the Russo-Japanese War also had a major impact. And nowhere was this more evident than in Asia. So Japan was an Asian power. And in the minds of many other Asian peoples, whether they were in India or Turkey or even places like Egypt or Indonesia, the fact that an Asian power had managed to modernize and then take on and defeat a European power was a major, major feat. It showed that all these narratives of many Western imperialists about the inherent racial superiority and the inherent superiority of the white race, that these things were not necessarily true. Hence, this cartoon from a French magazine, sort of showing Russia being defeated by Japan, while the Turks, the Arabs, and other Asian peoples look on and say, wait a minute, if Japan can do this, then why can't we? As a British official working in India at the time said, the reverberations of that victory have gone like a thunderclap through the whispering galleries of the East. Even in the remote villages of India, people talked about the victories of Japan as they sat in their circle and passed around the hookah at night. So, in this sense, the victory of Japan gives a sense of hope to those people in Turkey who want to modernize Turkey, who believe that they can bring it up to par with the Western powers once again, to people in Egypt or India or Indonesia and other colonies who now feel that, well, if the Japanese can modernize and defend their own independence, well, so can we. So in that sense, it does act as an inspiration to reformers, modernizers, and nationalists in all of these places. As for Japan, in Japan, the idea that Japan itself might lead Asia to greater independence from the European dominance starts to become popular amongst some Japanese intellectuals in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century. And it gets a real boost after this Russo-Japanese War. And it leads to the growth of the ideology of Pan-Asianism. Now, Pan-Asianism is an ideology that promotes the political and economic unity and cooperation of Asian peoples. At its core was the idea that Asian people should unite to modernize and throw off European imperialism by themselves. Um, and there were people in Japan, intellectuals and others, who felt that, well, Japan should really play a leading role in this endeavor to liberate Asia and unite Asia and liberate them from the dominance of the West. But the question is, how would it play its leading role? And this is where there was disagreement amongst Japanese intellectuals. Some people felt that, well, Japan should help its fellow Asian countries become free, and then they can all cooperate together, work together, help each other as equals, as sort of independent, equal states. For other Japanese, however, Um, Japan's role in Pan-Asianism was not to be a kind of first amongst equals, but to be a sort of leader and someone who would pull the other Asian societies up. And so, in their mind, the role that Japan would play would be a lot like the role that some European imperialists envisioned, for themselves as people who would civilize and raise up and modernize the peoples of India or Africa or other colonized places. In other words, the division was between people who said we want to help Asia by working alongside them, and those who said we want to help Asia by ruling over them. Um, and A question arose about what was going to happen with Korea. Now, Korea became a kind of test case for Pan-Asianism. There was many Pan-Asianists in Japan advocated a union with Korea. They said that yes, Korea and Japan should work together, and Korea should become modernized and industrialized as Japan has. But how was this to happen? Um, there were those who said, well, the way we should do it is to rule over Korea almost like a colony, basically like a colony. Whereas other Pan-Asianists believe that no, this is the wrong way to do it. This is the way the Europeans are behaving towards their colonies, taking over, ruling it, imposing reforms, and so-called quote unquote civilizing the savages. However, while other Pan-Asianists kind of said, no, 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 that's not what we should be doing. We should actually have union with Korea on the basis of equality. So they will be one state in a Pan-Asian state. We will be a separate state in a Pan-Asian state, and we will be equals. But those voices were kind of sidelined. They were sidelined, and it was ultimately the idea that Japan is going to be an imperial power and rule over other Asian colonies, other Asian places as colonies that won out and that was supported and promoted by the government. One more element of Japanese society, which became important in terms of its views of and dealings with the rest of Asia, was the role of secret societies. Around the turn of the century, around 1900 onwards, a number of secret societies were founded in Japan. These espoused patriotism and Japanese expansionism. And one of the most influential of these was the Black Dragon Society. So the membership was secret, known only to other members. But they tried to recruit. They deliberately did not want a very large membership, but they did want to recruit amongst influential people, amongst politicians, diplomats, military officers, businessmen. And the idea was that we will all pledge ourselves to the expansion of Japanese territory, to Japanese nationalism, to Japanese imperialism. So these people then lobbied government or tried to influence government to follow a more imperialistic policy. For example, annexing Korea. They also promoted Pan-Asianist ideas. For example, intellectual journals, academic journals were set up, newspapers were set up, and these newspapers and journals were set up not just in Japanese, but in other Asian languages as well. And they were distributed in places like India, China, Korea, and Taiwan, and so on, where they sort of promoted Pan-Asianist ideas. Some members of the Black Dragon Society even acted as unofficial spies. At this time, the Japanese military didn't really have its own spy network. But these officials, businessmen, and others would travel in places like Manchuria, in Eastern Russia, collect information, keep an eye on things, collect news, and then when they get back to Japan, pass it on to the Japanese army. So Japan then goes into the 1910s with this idea that we want to continue to expand, we want to continue to take over more territory, and that sort of becomes tied in with the sort of nationalism and militarism within the country. Speaking of nationalism and militarism, that brings us to the First World War. Now, the First World War breaks out in 1914. By 1914, Europe had become divided into two alliances. There was the Triple Entente, and the Triple Entente consisted of Britain, France, and Russia. And then there was the Triple Alliance, and the Triple Alliance consisted of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The problem for the Germans was that within the Triple Alliance, Italy was not a particularly strong power, nor was it especially enthusiastic about supporting the Germans and Austro-Hungarians. Austria-Hungary itself was a country that many people suspected was on the decline. It had many different national groups and minorities demanding independence. And so it had lots of internal issues and problems. Whereas Russia was beginning, was trying to modernize. Their defeat against Japan had led to all sorts of, and then, its internal revolt and so on had led to more modernizing governments coming to power that wanted to industrialize and build up the economy and improve its military capabilities as well. And that was obviously a threat for Germany because Russia was allied to France. France and Germany were traditionally hostile, and Britain now too was friendly with both France and Russia. So when the war breaks out, when the First World War breaks out, it breaks out over the issue of Bosnia. This was a territory that previously belonged to the Ottoman Empire, but it had been it had broken away and it had been kind of taken over by Austria-Hungary. The problem was that it was claimed by the country of Serbia. And Serbian nationalists in Austria-Hungary, particularly in Bosnia, demanded that it should be given to Serbia and should be united with Serbia. And it's one of these young nationalists, Serbian nationalists in Bosnia, who assassinate the heir to the throne in Austria-Hungary, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in July 1914. As a result of this assassination, the Austro-Hungarian Empire puts pressure on Serbia, blaming Serbia for arming, training, and these nationalists and stirring up anti-Austro-Hungarian feelings. Serbia appeals to its pan-Slavic brother Russia, and there is a threat that Russia might now take action against Austria-Hungary. Germany does not want Austria-Hungary to be weakened. It wants Austria-Hungary to be strong. And so Germany threatens the Russians. But the problem with that is that France is an ally of Germany. And so the Germans realize that if we do go to war with Russia, the more immediate threat they're going to face is France. As a result, the Germans invade France through Belgium, over here. This worries the British, and so Britain declares war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Ottoman Empire decides to side with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Italy decides initially we're just going to stay out of the war. Because Europe is now at war, because Britain is now fighting at war with two other great powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, Japan enters the war on the side of Britain, on the side of the Triple Entente. because, of course, Japan and Britain have the Anglo-Japanese alliance. So, um, so the war rages for the next 4 years. Japan participates, but not to the extent that the European powers do. The Japanese don't um, send big armies to Europe to fight in the war in Europe. They do declare war on Germany. They do send naval squadrons to the Mediterranean Sea and to protect British shipping, around in the Indian Ocean and the Southern Atlantic Ocean, um, against German submarines and so on. And they do take some action against Germany in the Far East. They launch an attack on the German-held port of Qingdao, which at the time was called Kiachao. And so it was obviously it was in China, but the Germans during the Scramble of Africa had kind of forced the Chinese to hand it over to them, and they controlled it. So the Japanese now seized control of it. The Japanese also attack and invade the German colonies in the Pacific, places such as the Marianas, Palau, the Carolinas, Marshall Islands, the Bismarck Archipelago, which is in Guinea, and they take over these colonies as well. Um, so there is some direct participation in the war, in the fighting, but it is limited by the Japanese. Um, their their involvement in the war is much larger in a different way, and that is through trade. Now, during the war, the Europeans became completely focused on all their industry, um, became completely focused on creating stuff to kill each other with. So all the factories, all their resources were focused on this goal. They set up arms factories, ammunition factories. Most of the young men enlisted and went off to fight. Millions of young women entered the workforce, um, and industries converted, to producing war material. Um, and in this kind of situation, those factories that previously had produced goods for export were no longer producing goods for export. They were just producing goods for the armies to fight with. So European exports completely collapsed. Um, European exports to places like China, to places like South America, to places like um, East Asia really fell. Um, and in China in particular, when European trade to China collapses, um, the Chinese people they still have a high demand for goods, especially manufactured goods. It is now American and Japanese exports that increase in China, replacing European goods in China and the Far East. And as a result, America and Japan start to become more economically influential in China, while the European influence in China falls. All right. So, um, what happens to Japanese trade and merchant shipping? Japanese factories are now producing goods, not just to sell in China, but also to sell to Europe as well. After all, the Europeans have an insatiable demand for stuff to clothe their armies, to transport their armies, to arm their armies, to equip their armies, and of course to kill each other with. So Japan's heavy industry, especially its iron, steel, and chemicals, greatly expand to meet this demand during World War One. And cotton production, cotton cloth production used in army uniforms, massively increases. To cater to carrying all of this extra trade, the size of Japanese merchant fleet doubles. The merchant fleet are those ships that carry goods. And Japanese banks and businesses also expand, especially in China. From 1916 onwards, the Chinese governments, which, a little bit like the Pakistani governments these days, requires loans to survive. Um, well, those loans are no longer forthcoming from Western banks, because Western banks are loaning whatever money they have to their governments to keep fighting, but rather from Japanese banks. And what that means is that now, again, Japan starts to grow in influence in China, and China now has debt to Japan more and less so to the Europeans. So countries like Russia, which previously had been a problem for Japanese ambitions in East Asia, are now no longer a problem because they are completely focused on the war in Europe. In 1916, the Russians recognized that Mongolia and northern Manchuria are going to be under the Japanese sphere of influence. Japan basically hopes to take advantage of European distraction and Chinese weakness to kind of increase their own influence, and they want to get this done um, on an official basis. So in 1916, they present the Chinese government with what are known as the 21 demands. These 21 demands, if China had accepted them, would have led to China basically placing itself under Japanese control. It would have turned China into a Japanese protectorate. And it also would have reduced European influence in China. So, what were Japan's 21 demands? Well, we don't need to know every single one of them, but you can roughly divide the 21 demands into 5 groups of demands. And these 5 groups were: one, that Japan's dominant position in the Yaotung or Shandong Peninsula, which it had conquered in 1905 from Russia, would be confirmed by the Chinese government. Secondly, Japanese dominance in southern Manchuria and eastern Inner Mongolia would be recognized. So remember these areas, which the Russians kind of said, all right, fine, it's your sphere of influence, we won't get involved. Thirdly, Chinese government would acknowledge Japan's interest in having an industrial complex in central China. So they would be able to set up industries, factories to produce goods that can be sold in China and do this without paying any taxes. Group 4 of the demands forbade China from giving any further concessions, especially coastal or island concessions, to foreign powers, to any foreign powers, except for Japan. Again, this was a way to try and reduce European influence while increasing Japanese influence in China. And the final set of demands was probably the most egregious one in terms of how it would have affected Chinese independence. Group 5 required China to install Japanese advisors to be basically in charge of the Chinese government, the Chinese economy, and the Chinese military. Now, when these 21 demands were made, the Chinese obviously were not very happy about them. In fact, there were even protests saying, we don't want Japan to accept the government to accept these demands. We don't want the Japanese to take over. The Chinese government, however, was not really in a very strong position to resist. And so they kind of crumbled or gave in to most of these demands, the first 4 of them. It was the 5th demand that they held out and said, we can't do this. Now, this is where the Americans get involved. At this time, America was still not involved in the First World War. They were neutral. But if you remember, America was always very keen about an open door policy in China. And the 21 demands would have really maybe brought an end to the open door policy. So the USA steps in and says, wait a minute, hang on. We do not agree to China having to sign any agreement in which the open door policy will be threatened and China's sovereignty will be threatened. So the Japanese kind of had a choice. Do we take on the Americans here? No, they didn't want to take on the Americans here. They didn't feel that they were powerful enough to take on the Americans, and as a result, Japan decided to withdraw the fifth group of demands, and the Chinese government accepted the rest. But what's important here is that this really does set the stage for the Japanese and American rivalry over East Asia. Because European influence in China was pretty much almost dead, even after the war. It was severely reduced. It was American and Japanese who were increasing their influence over China. They would become rivals over China, and ultimately this would lead to the American and Japanese going to war in 1941 during the Second World War. So if you ever wondered what was behind the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in the Second World War, it was a lot to do with the rivalry over China and East Asia. So here is a cartoon. It was actually a German cartoon. Of course, the Germans at this time, it's a German propaganda cartoon. The Germans at this time did not like Japan because Japan was technically at war with them. In which Japan is depicted as a little boy. He's playing with his toy warships, his new modern fleet. And here comes Uncle Sam, who represents the United States, who is pulling his ear, this naughty boy of Japan, and saying that don't be sassy to the Japanese. So it's kind of depicting the fact that America stepped in and forced the Japanese to back off of their 21 demands. So the war, America does eventually enter World War I. And American entry into the war is one of the decisive factors that leads to victory for the Allied side, for Britain, France, USA at that time, Italy, and Japan. And after the end of the war in 1918, in January 1917, the victorious countries' powers meet at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. The leaders are of all the different allied countries are there. There's many countries represented, but the main decisions, in theory, are going to be made by the Big Five. That is, the leaders of USA, Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. Now, again, this can be considered as evidence that by 1918 or by the end of 1918, Japan was recognized as a great power. You don't get invited to a massive international conference and be seated at the same table as the other four great powers and be referred to as part of the Big Five. That is going to be the sort of decision-making body of the Paris Peace Conference. So one can argue this was the ultimate recognition of their great power status. And then, of course, there is the fact that their economy has grown hugely during the First World War. Their territory has grown because of them capturing these islands in the Pacific. That means that they are able now to build naval and air bases in the Pacific, much further away from just where Japan was. They are able to put pressure on China and have increased influence of China. All of these could be seen as evidence that Japan was now a great power. On the other hand, um, it has to be pointed out that though Japan was a member of the Big Five, in reality, it was only the Big Three who made the final decisions. Japan and later Italy were kind of sidelined in the conversations between the Big Three, and it's the Big Three who kind of made the main decisions. So you can again make the argument, the counter argument, that it was the Big Three who really had influence. Yes, Japan had a seat at the High Council. It was considered one of the five decision makers. But the reality, and most people knew it, was that it was actually a Big Three who was making the decisions. And as evidence of the fact that Japan could not always get its way at the Paris Peace Conference, um, at the Paris Peace Conference, the League of Nations is set up, and the Japanese ask for the League of Nations to include a um, a racial equality clause. Racial equality clause. In other words, the covenant, which is the sort of document, the founding document of the League of Nations, should have a clause that says that we recognize that all races are equal. This is rejected by the Big Three, particularly, in fact, the Americans, because they say, no, we are not going to recognize that, and we're not going to put that into our charter. So once again, you can question, were they really being treated as an equal, as a great power, if even something as simple and straightforward as this was rejected? So, once again, to recap, we have looked at Japanese policy in Korea, Manchuria, and China after the Russo-Japanese War. We have looked at Japan's role in the First World War. We've seen how they benefited from the First World War, and their economy grew, their trade grew, their influence grew. They got more naval and military bases. How they tried to use that leverage or influence over China to impose even greater control over China, but how this was blocked by the United States. So they kind of had to back down on that issue. And then we have looked at their role in the League of Nations, in the Paris Peace Conference. And then we can consider taking all of this evidence together, and including previous evidence such as the alliance with Britain, the defeat of Russia, the defeat of China, its military and economic modernization. We can take all that into account to consider the argument, was Japan a world power in 1918? If it was, when did it become a world power? Was it before the First World War or during the First World War? All right, so that is it for this class. I hope you have enjoyed it. Take care and farewell.